Hello, my darling, and welcome to today's story time. Today, I wanted to shout out a few of you kind listeners who have made donations and messaged me about this upcoming surgery that I have for the tumor. Thank you so much to Tyler and Stephanie, Georgia, Alan, and Luke. Thank you so much. We have in the background our blowing desert wind to help you fall asleep. And now, on with our story time. The men climbed the hill, and they were tired when they reached the top. But there they saw a crystal shop that offered refreshing mint tea. They went to drink the tea, which was served in beautiful crystal glasses. "My wife never thought of this," said one, and he bought some crystal. He was entertaining guests that night, and the guests would be impressed by the beauty of the glassware. The other man remarked that tea was always more delicious when it was served in crystal, because the aroma was retained. The third said that it was a tradition in the Orient to use crystal glasses for tea because it had magic powers. Before long, the news spread, and a great many people began to climb the hill to see the shop that was doing something new in trade that was so old. Other shops were open that served tea and crystal, but they weren't at the top of a hill, and they had little business. Eventually, the merchant had to hire 2 more employees. He began to import enormous quantities of tea, along with his crystal, and his shop was sought out by men and women with a thirst for things new. And in that way, the months passed. The boy awoke before dawn. It had been 11 months and 9 days since he had first set foot on the African continent. He dressed in his Arabian clothing of white linen, bought especially for this day. He put his headcloth in place and secured it with a ring made of camel skin. Wearing his new sandals, he descended the stairs silently. The city was still sleeping. He prepared himself a sandwich and drank some hot tea from a crystal glass. Then he sat in the sun-filled doorway, smoking the hookah. He smoked in silence, thinking of nothing, and listening to the sound of the wind that brought the scent of the desert. When he had finished his smoke, he reached into one of his pockets and sat there for a few moments, regarding what he had withdrawn. It was a bundle of money, enough to buy himself 120 sheep, a return ticket, and a license to import products from Africa into his own country. He waited patiently for the merchant to awaken and open the shop, and the 2 went off to have some more tea. "I'm leaving today," said the boy. "I have the money I need to buy my sheep, and you have the money you need to go to Mecca." The old man said nothing. "Will you give me your blessing?" asked the boy. "You have helped me." The man continued to prepare his tea, saying nothing. Then he turned to the boy. "I'm proud of you," he said. "You brought a new feeling into my crystal shop. But you know that I'm not going to Mecca, just as you know that you're not going to buy your sheep." "Well, who told you that?" said the boy, startled. "Maktub," said the old crystal merchant, but he gave the boy his blessing. The boy went to his room and packed his belongings. They filled 3 sacks. As he was leaving, he saw in the corner of the room his old shepherd's pouch. It was bunched up, and he had hardly thought of it for a long time. As he took his jacket out of the pouch, thinking to give it to someone in the street, the 2 stones fell to the floor, Urim and Thummim. It made the boy think of the old king, and it startled him to realize how long it had been since he thought of him. For nearly a year, He had been working incessantly, thinking only of putting aside enough money so that he could return to Spain with pride. Never stop dreaming, the old king had said. Follow the omens. The boy picked up Urim and Thummim and, once again, had the strange sensation that the old king was nearby. He had worked hard for a year, and the omens were that it was time to go. I'm going to go back to doing just what I did before, the boy thought, even though the sheep didn't teach me to speak Arabic. But the sheep had taught him something even more important, that there was a language in the world that everyone understood, a language that the boy had used throughout the time that he was trying to improve things at the shop. It was the language of enthusiasm, of things accomplished with love and purpose, and as part of a search for something believed in and desired. Tangier was no longer a strange city, and he felt that, just as he had conquered this place, he could conquer the world. When you want something, the old king had said, all the universe conspires to help you achieve it. But the old king hadn't said anything about being robbed, or about endless desert, or about people who know what their dreams are but don't want to realize them. The old king hadn't told him that the pyramids were just a pile of stones, or that anyone could build one in his backyard, and he had forgotten to mention that when you have enough money to buy a flock larger than the one you had before, you should buy it. The boy picked up his pouch and put it with his other things. He went down the stairs and found the merchant waiting on a foreign couple, while two other customers walked about the shop, drinking tea from crystal glasses. There was more activity than usual for this time of the morning. From where he stood, he saw for the first time that the merchant's hair was very much like the hair of the old king. He remembered the smile of the candy seller on his first day in Tangier, when he had nothing to eat and nowhere to go. That smile had also been the old king's smile. It's almost as if he had been here and left his mark, he thought. And yet, none of these people has ever met the old king. On the other hand, he said that he always appeared to help those who are trying to realize their destiny. He left without saying goodbye to the crystal merchant. He didn't want to cry with the other people there. He was going to miss the place and all the good things he had learned. He was more confident in himself, though, and felt as though he could conquer the world. But I'm going back to the fields that I know, to take care of my flock again, he said to himself with certainty. But he was no longer happy with his decision. He had worked for an entire year to make a dream come true, and that dream, minute by minute, was becoming less important. Maybe because that wasn't really his dream. Who knows, he thought. Maybe it's better to be like the crystal merchant, never to go to Mecca, and just to go through life wanting to do so. He was trying to convince himself. But as he held Urim and Thummim in his hand, they had transmitted to him the strength and will of the old king. By coincidence, or maybe it was an omen, the boy thought. He came to the bar he'd entered on his first day there. The thief wasn't there, and the owner bought him a cup of tea. I can always go back to being a shepherd, the boy thought. I learned how to care for sheep, and I haven't forgotten how that's done. But maybe I'll never have another chance to get to the pyramids in Egypt. The old man wore a breastplate of gold, and he knew about my past. He really was a king, a wise king. The hills of Andalusia were only 2 hours away, but there was an entire desert between him and the pyramids. Yet the boy felt that there was another way to regard his situation. He was actually 2 hours closer to his treasure. The fact that the 2 hours had stretched into an entire year didn't matter. I know why I want to get back to my flock, he thought. I understand sheep. They're no longer a problem, and they can be good friends. On the other hand, I don't know if the desert can be a friend, and it's in the desert I have to search for my treasure. If I don't find it, I can always go home. I finally have enough money and all the time I need, so why not? He suddenly felt tremendously happy. He could always go back to being a shepherd. He could always become a crystal salesman again. Maybe the world had other hidden treasures, but he had a dream, and he had met with a king. It doesn't happen to just anyone. He was planning as he left the bar. He had remembered that one of the crystal merchant's suppliers transported his crystal by means of caravans across the desert. He held Urim and Thummim in his hand. Because of those two stones, he was once again on his way to his treasure. I am always nearby, the old king had told him, when someone wants to realize their destiny. What could it cost to go over to the supplier's warehouse and find out if the pyramids were really that far away? The Englishman was sitting on a bench in a structure that smelled of animals, sweat, and dust. It was part warehouse, part corral. I never thought I'd end up in a place like this, he thought, as he leafed through the pages of a chemical journal. 10 years at the university, and here I am in a corral. But he had to move on. He believed in omens. All his life and all his studies were aimed at finding the one true language of the universe. First, he had studied Esperanto, then the world's religions, and now it was alchemy. He knew how to speak Esperanto. He understood all the major religions as well, but he wasn't yet an alchemist. He had unraveled the truths behind important questions, but his studies had taken him to a point beyond which he could not seem to go. He had tried in vain to establish a relationship with an alchemist, but the alchemists were strange people. They thought only about themselves, and almost always refused to help him. Who knows? Maybe they had failed to discover the secret of the masterwork, the philosopher's stone, and for this reason kept their knowledge to themselves. He had already spent much of the fortune left to him by his father, fruitlessly seeking the philosopher's stone. He had spent enormous amounts of time at the great libraries of the world, and had purchased all the rarest and most important volumes on alchemy. In one, he had read that, many years ago, a famous Arabian alchemist had visited Europe. It was said that he was more than 200 years old, and that he had discovered the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life. The Englishman had been profoundly impressed by this story, but he would never have thought of it as more than just a myth, had not a friend of his, returning from an archaeological expedition in the desert, told him about an Arab that was possessed of exceptional powers. He lives at the Al Fayoum oasis, his friend had said, and people say that he is 200 years old, and he's able to transform any metal into gold. The Englishman could not contain his excitement. He canceled all his commitments and pulled together the most important of his books. And now here he was, sitting inside a dusty, smelly warehouse. Outside, a huge caravan was being prepped for the crossing of the Sahara and was scheduled to pass through Al Fayoum. I'm going to find that damned alchemist, the Englishman thought, and the odor of the animals became a bit more tolerable. A young Arab, also loaded down with baggage, entered and greeted the Englishman. "Where are you bound?" asked the young Arab. "I'm going into the desert," the man answered, turning back to his reading. He didn't want any conversation at this point. What he needed to do was to review all he had learned over the years because the alchemist would certainly put him to the test. The young Arab took out a book and began to read. The book was written in Spanish. That's good, thought the Englishman. He spoke Spanish better than Arabic, and if this boy were going to Al Fayoum, there would be someone to talk to when there were no other important things left to do. That's strange, said the boy, as he tried once again to read the burial scene that began the book. I've been trying for 2 years to read this book, and I never get past these first few pages. Even without a king to provide an interruption, he was unable to concentrate. He still had some doubts about the decision he had made, but he was able to understand one thing. Making a decision was only the beginning of things. When someone makes a decision, he is really diving into a strong current that will carry him to places he's never dreamed of when he first made that decision. When I decided to seek out my treasure, he thought, I never imagined that I'd wind up working in a crystal shop, and joining this caravan may have been my decision, but where it goes is going to be a mystery to me. Nearby was the Englishman reading a book. He seemed unfriendly and had looked irritated when the boy had entered. They might even have become friends, but the Englishman closed off the conversation. The boy closed his book. He felt that he didn't want to do anything that might make him look like the Englishman. He took Urim and Thummim from his pocket and began to play with them. The stranger shouted, Urim and Thummim. In a flash, the boy put them back in his pocket. They're not for sale, he said. Well, they're not worth much, the Englishman answered. They're only made of rock crystal, and there are millions of rock crystals in the earth. But those who know about such things would know that those are Urim and Thummim. I didn't know that they had them in this part of the world. The boy answered, They were given to me as a present by a king. The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he put his hand into his pocket and took out 2 stones that were the same as the boy's. Did you say a king? He asked. I guess you don't believe that a king would talk to someone like me, a shepherd, said the boy, wanting to end the conversation. Not at all, said the stranger. Your shepherds were the first to recognize a king that the rest of the world refused to acknowledge. So, it's not surprising that kings would talk to shepherds. And he went on, fearing that the boy wouldn't understand what he was talking about. It's in the Bible, he said, the same book that taught me about Urim and Thummim. These stones were the only form of divination permitted by God. The priests carried them in a golden breastplate. The boy was suddenly happy to be there at the warehouse. Maybe this is an omen, said the Englishman half aloud. The boy asked, Who told you about omens? Everything in life is an omen, said the Englishman, now closing the journal he was reading. There is a universal language, understood by everybody, but already forgotten. I am in search of that universal language, among other things. That's why I'm here. I have to find a man who knows the universal language, an alchemist. The conversation was interrupted by the warehouse boss. You're in luck, you two, he said. There's a caravan leaving today for Al Fayoum. But I'm going to Egypt, the boy said. Al Fayoum is in Egypt, said the Arab. What kind of Arab are you? That's a good luck omen, said the Englishman. If I could, I'd write a huge encyclopedia about the words luck and coincidence. It's with those words that the universal language is written. He told the boy that it was no coincidence that he had met him with Urim and Thummim in his hand. And he asked the boy if he too were in search of the alchemist. I'm looking for a treasure, said the boy, but he immediately regretted saying this. But the Englishman appeared not to attach any importance to it. "In a way, so am I," he replied. The boy responded, "I don't even know what alchemy is." The warehouse boss called for them to come outside. "I'm the leader of the caravan," said a dark-eyed, bearded man. "I hold the power of life and death for every person I take with me. The desert is a capricious lady, and sometimes she drives men crazy." There were almost 200 people gathered there, and 400 animals, camels, horses, mules, and fowl. In the crowd were women, children, and a number of men with swords at their belts and rifles slung over their shoulders. The Englishman had several suitcases filled with books. There was a babble of noise, and the leader had to repeat himself several times for everyone to understand what he was saying. There are a lot of different people here, and each has his own god, but the only God I serve is Allah, and in his name I swear that I will do everything possible once again to win out over the desert. But I want each and every one of you to swear by the God you believe in that you will follow my orders no matter what. In the desert, disobedience means death." There was a murmur from the crowd. Each was praying quietly to his or her own God. The boy swore to Jesus Christ. The Englishman said nothing, and the murmur lasted longer than a simple vow would have. The people were also praying to heaven for protection. A long note was sounded on a bugle, and everyone mounted up. The boy and the Englishman had bought camels and climbed uncertainly onto their backs. The boy felt sorry for the Englishman's camel, loaded down as he was with the cases of books. "There's no such thing as coincidence," said the Englishman, picking up the conversation where it had been interrupted. "I'm here because a friend of mine heard of an Arab who—" But the caravan began to move, and it was impossible to hear what the Englishman was saying. The boy knew what he was about to describe, though. The mysterious chain that links one thing to another. The same chain that caused him to become a shepherd, that had caused his recurring dream, that had brought him to a city near Africa to find a king and to be robbed in order to meet a crystal merchant, and the closer one gets to realizing his destiny, the more that destiny becomes his true reason for being, thought the boy. The caravan moved toward the east. It traveled during the morning, halted when the sun was at its strongest, and resumed late in the afternoon. The boy spoke very little with the Englishman, who spent most of his time with his books. The boy observed in silence the progress of the animals and people across the desert. Now, everything was quite different from how it was that day they had set out. Then, there had been confusion and shouting, the cries of children and the whinnying of animals, all mixed with the nervous orders of the guides and the merchants. But in the desert, there was only the sound of the eternal wind and of the hoofbeats of the animals, when the guides spoke very little to one another. "I've crossed these sands many times," said one of the camel drivers one night. "But the desert is so huge, and the horizons so distant, that they can make a person feel small, and as if he should remain silent." The boy understood intuitively what he meant, even without ever having set foot in the desert before. Whenever he saw the sea or fire, he fell silent, impressed by the elemental force. "I've learned things from the sheep, and I've learned things from crystal," he thought. "I can learn something from the desert, too. It seems old and wise." The wind never stopped, and the boy remembered the day he had sat at the fort in Tarifa with the same blowing wind in his face. It reminded him of the wool from his sheep. His sheep were now seeking food and water in the fields of Andalusia, as they always had. "They're not my sheep anymore," he said to himself, without nostalgia. They must be used to their new shepherd, and they've probably already forgotten me. That's good. Creatures like the sheep that are used to traveling know about moving on. He thought of the merchant's daughter and was sure that she had probably married, perhaps to a baker or to another shepherd who could read and tell her exciting stories. After all, he probably wasn't the only one, but he was excited at his intuitive understanding of the camel driver's comment. Maybe he was also learning the universal language that deals with the past and the present of all people. Hunches, his mother used to call them. The boy was beginning to understand that intuition is really a sudden immersion of the soul into the universal current of life. The histories of all people are connected, and we are able to know everything because it's all written there. Maktub, the boy said, remembering the crystal merchant. The desert was all sand in some stretches and rocky in others. When the caravan was blocked by a boulder, it had to go around. If there was a large rocky area, they had to make a major detour. If the sand was too fine for the animals' hooves, they sought a way where the sand was more substantial. In some places, the ground was covered with the salt of dried-up lakes. The animals balked at such places, and the camel drivers were forced to dismount and unburden their charges. The drivers carried the freight themselves over such treacherous footing, and then reloaded the camels. If a guide were to fall ill or die, the camel drivers would draw lots and appoint a new one. But all this happened for one basic reason. No matter how many detours and adjustments it made, the caravan moved toward the same compass point. Once obstacles were overcome, it returned to its course, sighting on a star that indicated the location of the oasis. When the people saw that star shining in the morning sky, they knew they were on the right course toward water, palm trees, shelter, and other people. It was only the Englishman who was unaware of all this. He was, for the most part, immersed in reading his books. The boy, too, had his book, and he had tried to read it during the first few days of the journey, but he found it much more interesting to observe the caravan and listen to the wind. As soon as he had learned to know his camel better and to establish a relationship with him, he threw the book away. Although the boy had developed a superstition that each time he opened the book, he would learn something important, he decided it was an unnecessary burden. And this, my darling, ends our story time for today. As always, I hope that you have very sweet and creepy dreams